To understand the impossible weight that rested on the shoulders of Carl Brashear, you first have to understand the suit. The Mark V deep-sea diving suit is a monster of canvas, spun copper, and lead. It weighs nearly 200 pounds on land. When you bolt the helmet onto the breastplate, you are sealing yourself inside a coffin. The air you breathe is pumped down through a rubber hose from the surface. If that hose gets cut, you die. If the compressor fails, you die. If you panic and rise too fast, your blood boils like a shook-up soda bottle, and you die screaming in agony. Now, imagine wearing that 200-pound coffin while standing on one leg. Imagine doing it while the men holding your airline, the men holding your life in their hands, hate you. They hate you not because of what you did, but because of what you are. They have left notes on your bunk promising to drown you. They have sabotaged your equipment. They have cut your air supply just to see if you would panic. And yet, you keep diving. You keep descending into the cold, crushing blackness of the ocean because you know that the only way to beat them is to be better than them. This is the story of Master Chief Petty Officer Carl Brashear. Hollywood made a movie about him called Men of Honor. They got Cuba Gooding Jr. to play him. It was a good movie. But Hollywood, in its desire to sell popcorn, actually softened the blow. The reality of Carl Brashear's life was harder, grittier, and far more dangerous than anything a screenwriter could invent. He was the first African-American master diver in the history of the United States Navy. He was the first amputee to be recertified as a diver. He hunted for lost nuclear bombs off the coast of Spain while the Cold War threatened to turn hot. He faced down sharks, the Bens, and the Ku Klux Klan. They told him that black men don't swim. They told him he didn't have the intelligence for the physics of diving. They told him he was a cripple who belonged in a wheelchair. He answered them by walking on the bottom of the sea. But before we dive into the abyss with Master Chief Brashear, I have a question for you. This is a story about overcoming the crushing pressure of your environment, literally and metaphorically. I want to know where you are fighting your battles from today. Whether you are in Detroit, Lagos, Tokyo, or a naval base in the middle of the ocean, drop your city in the comments below. Let's build a global crew for this dive. To understand the iron will of the man, you have to go back to the soil that grew him. Carl Brashear was born in 1931 in Tonyville, Kentucky. He wasn't born into a naval family. He was born into the dirt poverty of a sharecropper's shack. Sharecropping was essentially slavery by another name. You worked land you didn't own for a white boss who took the profit, leaving you with just enough to survive until the next harvest. Carl was the sixth of 8 children. His world was the field. He walked miles to a segregated one-room schoolhouse, but his education was cut short after the 7th grade. His family needed him to work. There is a moment from his childhood that Carl would later recount, a moment that set the trajectory of his life. He was working the fields, hot, tired, and covered in dust. He looked at his father, MacDonald Brashear, a man broken by a lifetime of labor for another man's gain. His father looked back at him and said something that would echo in Carl's mind for decades. "You get out of here, Carl. You go join the army. You go join the Navy. You get an education. Don't you end up like me." It wasn't just advice. It was a command. It was a father telling his son to run for his life. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed an executive order desegregating the U.S. military. On paper, the armed forces were now equal. In reality, the Navy was still a gentleman's club, and the unspoken rule was that black men were there to serve, not to fight. When Carl enlisted in 1948, he was 17 years old. He had a 7th grade education and a heart full of fire. He thought he was going to see the world. He thought he was going to be a warrior. Instead, the Navy handed him an apron. Like almost all black recruits of that era, Carl was steered into the steward's branch. He was assigned to the officer's mess. His job was to cook food, shine shoes, and clean up after white officers. He was a servant in a uniform. It was the sharecropper's life all over again, just on a boat. For many men, this would have been the end of the dream. They would have served their 4 years, kept their heads down, and gone home. But Carl Brashear had a defect. He was incapable of accepting his place. He was stationed on the aircraft carrier USS Tripoli. One day, while scrubbing pots or serving coffee, he went up to the flight deck. He saw something that stopped him in his tracks. He saw the divers. The Navy divers were the elite of the ship. They were the ones who jumped into the water to rescue pilots who crashed on takeoff. They were the ones who fixed the propellers. They walked with a swagger. They were fearless. And of course, they were all white. Carl watched them. He watched the way they moved. He watched the respect the other sailors gave them. And he decided, right there on the deck of the Tripoli, that he was going to be a diver. He didn't know how to swim. He didn't know physics. He didn't know that the Navy had an unwritten policy of never accepting black candidates for diving school. He just knew he wanted it. He started by asking the white divers for tips. Most ignored him. Some mocked him. "Stick to the kitchen, boy," they said. "The water's too deep for you." But there was one master diver who saw something in the young steward's eyes. He told Carl, "If you want to dive, you have to pass the test. And the test is swimming." Carl began to train. He swam in the polluted waters of the harbors. He swam until his muscles burned. He studied the diving manuals in his bunk at night, struggling with the words because of his limited education, but memorizing the diagrams. He applied to diving school. His application was lost. He applied again. It was rejected. He applied again. Finally, in 1954, through sheer persistence and perhaps a clerical error, he was accepted to the U.S. Navy Diving and Salvage School in Bayonne, New Jersey. He packed his bag. He polished his shoes. He left the galley behind. He thought he had won. He thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. He was walking into a trap. Bayonne was not a school. It was a hazing ground. The instructors and the other students were furious that a black man had been allowed in. They viewed his presence as an insult to the profession. They made a pact. Carl Brashear would not graduate. They would break him, drown him, or force him to quit. On his first day, he found a note on his bunk. It was crude, handwritten, and terrifying. "We're going to drown you, nigger. Don't get in the water." Most men would have packed their bags right then. A threat like that, in a job where your life depends on your classmates holding your airline, is not a joke. It is a promise. Carl folded the note. He put it in his pocket, and he walked to the pool. He wasn't just fighting for a certification. He was fighting for his life. And he knew that if he showed even a millimeter of fear, the sharks, the human ones, would tear him apart. The ocean is a lonely place, but the loneliest place on Earth is inside a Mark V diving helmet, 60 feet underwater, when you know that the man holding your lifeline wishes you were dead. Diving school in Bayonne was not an academy. It was a torture chamber designed to weed out the weak. For the white students, the pressure was professional. If they failed, they went back to chipping paint on a destroyer. For Carl Brashear, the pressure was existential. If he failed, he confirmed the lie. If he washed out, every racist officer in the Navy would point to his file and say, "See, we told you. They can't handle the pressure." He was fighting for the reputation of an entire race, one breath at a time. The harassment began on the surface. The buddy system is the sacred law of diving. You never dive alone. You rely on your partner to check your seals, to monitor your air pressure, to pull you up if you get in trouble. But at Bayonne, Carl Brashear was a pariah. No one wanted to be his buddy. When the instructor told the class to pair up, the white sailors would step away from him as if he were radioactive. They left him standing alone on the dock, humiliated, forcing the instructors to assign him a reluctant partner who would treat him with open contempt. Imagine the terror of that. You are about to be bolted into a suit that weighs as much as a refrigerator. You are about to be dropped into zero visibility mud. And the man checking your air valve is the same man who left a note on your pillow, calling you the N-word. Trust is the currency of survival. Carl had to dive with zero funds. The training dives were grueling. The water in the harbor was freezing, a sludge of oil, silt, and industrial waste. Visibility was often zero. You couldn't see your hand in front of your faceplate. You had to work by touch. You had to learn to tie knots, assemble pipes, and weld steel in total darkness, guided only by the sensation in your fingertips. For Carl, this was where his background saved him. He hadn't grown up with privilege. He had grown up with hard labor. His hands were strong. His mind was used to solving physical problems in the dirt. While the college-educated white sailors panicked in the dark, flailing around in the mud, Carl remained calm. He visualized the task. He worked the problem. But the students and instructors had other ways to break him. Sabotage in diving is subtle. It doesn't have to be a cut hose. It can be a valve turned just a little too tight, restricting the airflow so that you are constantly starving for oxygen. It can be a communication line accidentally unplugged, leaving you in silence. It can be a tool dropped from the surface that lands inches from your helmet. There were dives where Carl would feel his air supply drop. The hissing sound of the intake, the sound of life, would fade to a whisper. The carbon dioxide would begin to build up in the helmet. The headache would start, a pounding pressure behind the eyes. The panic reflex would kick in, the lizard brain screaming, "Surface! Surface now!" But Carl knew the game. If he panicked, if he blew his tanks and shot to the surface, he would fail. Or worse, he would get the bends and be crippled. So he didn't panic. He stood on the bottom of the bay, in the dark, and he waited. He slowed his heart rate. He breathed shallowly, conserving every molecule of oxygen. He tapped out messages on the line, calm and rhythmic. He forced them to turn the air back up. He forced them to realize that he wasn't going to crack. They were trying to drown a man who had already survived the drowning of his spirit in the Jim Crow South. They underestimated his lung capacity. But the water wasn't the only battlefield. The classroom was just as deadly. To be a master diver, you don't just need muscles. You need physics. You need to understand Boyle's law, Charles's law, the partial pressure of gases. You need to calculate decompression tables and buoyancy ratios. It is complex math and science. Carl Brashear had a 7th grade education. He had spent his youth behind a plow, not a desk. When he looked at the blackboard filled with equations, it might as well have been hieroglyphics. The white students laughed at him. They saw him struggling with the math and took it as proof of his inferiority. They mocked his reading level. They mocked his accent. "Why don't you quit, Cookie?" they would sneer. "Go back to the kitchen where you belong." But Carl had a secret weapon. Humility. He knew what he didn't know. He wasn't too proud to ask for help, even if he had to beg for it. He found the one instructor who was willing to give him a fair shake, and he asked for tutoring. He studied like a man possessed. While the other sailors went out drinking and chasing women in Bayonne, Carl sat in the barracks with his books. He studied until his eyes bled. He memorized the tables. He taught himself the math by brute force repetition. He turned his weakness into a fortress. Slowly, the grades improved. The practical scores were perfect. The written scores were passing. The instructors who wanted to fail him began to run out of excuses. The climax of the training came with the final evaluation dives. In the movie Men of Honor, this is depicted as the bag of tools scene, where the instructors cut the bag and scatter the tools in the mud. While Hollywood dramatized the specific mechanics, the spirit of the test was accurate. The instructors threw everything they could at him. They gave him the hardest assignments. They put him in the worst currents. They rigged the test to make him fail. On one particular salvage project, Carl was tasked with raising a sunken engine block. It was heavy, dangerous work. He was underwater for hours, fighting the current, the cold, and the exhaustion. His hands were numb. His suit was leaking. On the surface, the instructors watched the clock. They were waiting for the signal that he was aborting the dive. They had the paperwork ready to wash him out, but the signal never came. Instead, the water churned, the cables pulled tight, and slowly, impossibly, the engine block broke the surface. Carl had done it. He had done it faster and cleaner than any of the white students. When they pulled him up and took off his helmet, he was exhausted. His face was bruised from the pressure. He was shivering uncontrollably. But he looked the chief instructor in the eye, and he didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood there. He had proven that the ocean doesn't care about the color of your skin. The ocean only cares about competence. And he was competent. In 1954, Carl Brashear graduated from the U.S. Navy Diving and Salvage School. He became a salvage diver. There was no ceremony. There was no band. Most of his classmates refused to shake his hand. To them, he was still an intruder. He was a glitch in the system. But he had the patch. He had the rating. He was officially a United States Navy diver. He had broken the barrier. But breaking the barrier is only the first step. Surviving on the other side is the real challenge. Carl thought that graduating would earn him respect. He was wrong. It only painted a bigger target on his back. Now, he wasn't just a steward trying to be a diver. He was a diver taking a white man's job. The resentment in the fleet was palpable. He was assigned to escort ships and salvage vessels. He was given the dirty jobs, clearing fouled propellers in freezing water, retrieving bodies from crashed airplanes, searching for lost torpedoes in the mud. He did them all. He worked harder than anyone else because he knew he had to. He built a reputation as the go-to guy for the impossible jobs. If a prop was fouled and the sea was too rough, they called Brashear. If a valve was stuck and the space was too tight, they called Brashear. He was becoming a master of his craft. But the Navy wasn't done testing him. In the late 1950s and early 60s, the Cold War was heating up. The Navy was moving into the nuclear age. The missions were becoming more dangerous, more classified, and more critical. Carl Brashear was climbing the ranks, aiming for the highest rating a diver can achieve, Master Diver. But tragedy and destiny were waiting for him off the coast of Spain. In 1966, a B-52 bomber collided with a tanker aircraft during a refueling mission. 4 hydrogen bombs, nuclear weapons with the power to destroy cities, fell from the sky. 3 landed on the ground. 1 fell into the Mediterranean Sea. It was a geopolitical nightmare. The United States had lost a nuke. If the Soviets found it first, they would gain invaluable technology. If the bomb's casing corroded and released radiation, it would be an environmental catastrophe. The Navy mobilized every asset they had. They needed their best divers. They needed men who could work at extreme depths, in extreme danger, under extreme pressure. They called Carl Brashear. He was about to enter the most important mission of his life. He was about to hunt for the most dangerous object on Earth, and he was about to face an accident that would take his leg, but not his spirit. The training in Bayonne had taught him how to survive the hate of his fellow men. Now, he would have to survive the violence of physics itself. January 17th, 1966. The Cold War was freezing over. The world was living under the constant, low-humming threat of nuclear annihilation. And on a crisp morning over the coast of Palomares, Spain, that threat almost became a reality. A B-52 Stratofortress, a massive American bomber carrying 4 B-28 hydrogen bombs, collided mid-air with a KC-135 refueling tanker. The sky turned into a fireball. Debris rained down on the tomato fields of the quiet Spanish fishing village below. 3 of the nuclear bombs fell to the earth. 2 of them detonated their conventional explosives upon impact, scattering radioactive plutonium dust across the countryside. It was a disaster. It was an international incident. But the 4th bomb was the nightmare. The 4th bomb, weapon number 4, missed the land. It fell into the Mediterranean Sea. It vanished beneath the waves. This wasn't just a lost piece of equipment. This was a 1.1 megaton thermonuclear device. It had the destructive power of 70 Hiroshimas. If the casing breached, it would poison the Mediterranean for generations. If the Soviets found it first, they would possess the secrets of America's most advanced weaponry. The United States Navy scrambled. They launched one of the largest search and salvage operations in history. Task Force 65, 20 ships, thousands of men, submersibles, and the best divers in the fleet. They called the USS Hoist, and on the deck of the Hoist stood Carl Brashear. By 1966, Carl was no longer the frightened student in Bayonne. He was a first-class boatswain's mate. He was a hardened, salty veteran of the salvage trade. He had spent 12 years fighting the ocean and the racism of the Navy, and he had beaten them both. He was respected. When the call came to find the nuke, he wasn't just a member of the team. He was the acting master diver. He was the man in charge of the underwater operations. The search was a grueling, terrifying game of hide-and-seek. The Mediterranean floor off Palomares is a chaotic landscape of deep canyons, silt, and shifting currents. The bomb could be anywhere. For 80 days, the Navy searched. They used the experimental submersible Alvin to scour the depths. The world held its breath. The Soviets had trawlers, spy ships, circling the perimeter, watching, waiting for the Americans to fail. The pressure on Brashear was immense. He was diving deep, managing the complex gas mixtures, supervising a team of exhausted men. He was working 18-hour days. He was the glue holding the salvage operation together. Finally, in mid-March, they found it. The submersible Alvin spotted the bomb resting on a steep slope, 2,500 feet down, precariously perched on the edge of an underwater abyss. It was wrapped in its parachute, looking like a gray shroud. Now came the hard part. They had to get it up. They couldn't just grab it. It was too deep for divers to touch directly. They had to use a remote-controlled recovery vehicle called the Curve to attach lines to it. It was a delicate surgical operation performed with heavy machinery in rough seas. On March 23, 1966, the operation was reaching its climax. The USS Hoist was positioned directly over the recovery site. The seas were choppy. The wind was picking up. The deck was slick with spray and oil. Brashear was on the fantail, the rear deck, supervising the rigging. They were using a massive boat hook to secure a crate that would be used to lift equipment from the depths. The crane was straining. The steel cables were singing that high-pitched, deadly note that sailors know means tension is at the breaking point. The setup was dangerous. The towing cable was threaded through a pulley system attached to a mooring spud, a massive steel pipe used to secure the ship. The tension on the line was immense. The physics of the ocean were fighting the steel of the ship. Then the unthinkable happened. The mooring spud broke. It didn't just bend, it snapped under the torque. The steel pipe, weighing hundreds of pounds, tore loose from the deck. It became a missile. It swung across the fantail with the force of a wrecking ball. The sailors on the deck froze. But Carl Brashear didn't. He saw the pipe coming. He saw that it was heading straight for another sailor. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk. He moved. He shoved the sailor out of the way. He saved the man's life. But in doing so, he put himself in the path of the metal beast. The pipe struck Carl Brashear's left leg. It wasn't a clean break. It was a crushing impact. The steel pipe smashed his leg against the railing of the ship. It shattered the tibia and fibula. It pulverized the muscle. It nearly severed the foot completely. The sound was sickening. A wet crunch that was audible over the roar of the engines and the wind. Carl collapsed to the deck. The pain was absolute. It was a white-hot supernova that obliterated his vision. He looked down. His leg was a ruin. His boot was filled with blood. The bone was exposed. Chaos erupted on the fantail. "Medic! Man down! The chief is down!" Men were screaming. The deck was slippery with blood. But amidst the panic, there was one voice that remained calm. It was Carl Brashear. He was in shock. He was bleeding out. But he was still the acting master diver. He was still in command. As the medics rushed to him, applying tourniquets, cutting away the pant leg, Carl was giving orders. He was telling them to secure the line. He was telling them not to lose the equipment. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He grabbed the hand of one of his men and said, "Get that bomb." They loaded him onto a stretcher. A helicopter was called in. As he was lifted off the deck of the USS Hoist, swinging in the wind over the gray water, he looked back at the ship. He saw the bloodstain on the steel. He saw the faces of his men, pale with horror. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that his life as he knew it was over. The Navy has strict physical standards. You have to have 2 arms, 2 eyes, 2 legs. There are no exceptions. A diver with 1 leg is a contradiction in terms. It is impossible. He was flown to the Naval Hospital at Portsmouth, Virginia. The doctors took one look at the leg and shook their heads. It was a mess of infection and gangrene. The circulation was destroyed. They tried to save it. They performed surgeries. They pumped him full of antibiotics. For weeks, Carl lay in a hospital bed, fighting a fever, fighting the pain, fighting the reality that was closing in on him. The bomb was eventually recovered. A victory for the Navy, a victory for America. But for Carl, the victory was hollow. He was a cripple. The doctors gave him the news gently. The leg wasn't healing. It was dead meat attached to a living body. If they didn't do something, the infection would kill him. They gave him a choice. Option A, a long, painful process of reconstruction. Years of surgeries, a fused ankle. He would walk with a cane. He would be medically discharged from the Navy. He would go home with a pension and a wheelchair. Option B, amputation. Cut it off. Most men would have taken option A. Keep the leg, even if it doesn't work. Take the pension. Go home. You're a hero. You saved a man's life. You served your country. No one would blame you. But Carl Brashear wasn't most men. He looked at the doctors. He looked at the white sheets. And he thought about the deck of the Tripoli. He thought about the note on his pillow in Bayonne. He thought about his father in the dusty field in Kentucky, saying, "Don't you end up like me." If he took the discharge, he let them win. If he took the cane, he became the cripple they always said he was. He made the decision that would define his legend. "Cut it off," he said. The doctors were stunned. "If we amputate," they warned, "there is no guarantee you will stay in the Navy." "I didn't ask for a guarantee," Carl replied. "I asked you to cut it off. I can't dive with a dead leg, but I can dive with a plastic one." In May 1966, the surgeons removed Carl Brashear's left leg 4 inches below the knee. When he woke up from the anesthesia, he looked down at the empty space where his foot used to be. He didn't cry. He didn't mourn. He felt lighter. The dead weight was gone. Now, the real fight began. The Navy began the paperwork to discharge him. They stamped his file. Unfit for duty. They prepared his retirement package. They treated him with pity. Thank you for your service, Chief. Here's the door. But they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot they were dealing with a man who had held his breath while they tried to suffocate him. Carl Brashear wasn't going anywhere. He was about to launch a one-man war against the United States Navy's medical bureaucracy. He was about to do something that had never been done in the history of the armed forces. He was going to become the first amputee deep-sea diver. He traded his hospital bed for a gym. He traded self-pity for sweat. He was about to put himself through a torture regimen that would make the training at Bayonne look like a vacation. The stump was raw meat. That is the only way to describe it. In 1966, prosthetics were not the high-tech, carbon fiber marvels we see today on Paralympians. They were crude contraptions of wood, hard plastic, and leather straps. They were heavy. They were stiff. And when you strapped one onto a leg that had just been surgically severed, the friction was agonizing. Carl Brashear lay in his bed at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the room was broken only by the throbbing of his own pulse in a limb that was no longer there. The phantom pain was real. His brain was still trying to send signals to a foot that was incinerated in an incinerator somewhere in Virginia. It felt like his toes were being crushed in a vise, even though he had no toes. The Navy doctors were kind, but they were firm. They brought him the discharge papers. They brought him brochures for retirement homes. They treated him like a broken piece of equipment that had been written off the inventory. "You've done your bit, Chief," they said. "Go home." But Carl didn't sign the papers. Instead, he started doing push-ups. He did push-ups until his arms shook. He did sit-ups until his stomach cramped. He hopped on one leg around the ward until he collapsed. He was turning his hospital room into a boot camp. When the prosthetic leg finally arrived, it was an instrument of torture. He put it on. He stood up. The pain shot up his spine like a lightning bolt. The socket ground against the scar tissue of the amputation site. Every step was a fresh injury. He walked anyway. He walked the halls of the hospital at night, the clack, clack, clack of his plastic foot echoing on the linoleum. He fell. He got up. He fell again. He got up. He bled into the socket until it squished when he stepped. He would go back to his room, pour the blood out of the prosthetic, wrap his stump in fresh bandages, and go back out. He wasn't just learning to walk. He was learning to hide the pain. He knew that if the doctors saw him wince, if they saw a single bead of sweat that betrayed his agony, they would board him out. He had to act. He had to walk with a swagger when he felt like screaming. But walking wasn't enough. He was a diver, and a diver needs water. The Navy had restricted him to the hospital grounds. He was a prisoner of his own recovery. But Carl Brashear was an expert at infiltration. He waited until the doctors went home. He waited until the nurses were at the station. And then he slipped out. He went to the diving locker at the nearby base. He had friends there. Men who respected him. Men who didn't care about the number of legs he had. They helped him. They bolted him into the Mark V suit. On land, the suit weighs nearly 200 pounds. For a man with 2 legs, it is a burden. For a man with 1 leg, it is a crushing weight. The center of gravity is all wrong. The prosthetic feels like a dead anchor. But then, he dropped into the water. And the miracle happened. In the water, he was weightless. The buoyancy compensated for the missing limb. He could move. He could work. He realized with a surge of adrenaline that he wasn't broken. He was just different. He began a secret life. By day, he was the model patient, smiling at the nurses. By night, or on weekends, he was diving. He had his friends take pictures. He wanted proof. He documented himself climbing ladders, welding steel, and assembling flanges underwater. He was building a portfolio of evidence for a trial that hadn't happened yet. Eventually, the secret got out. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, bummed, found out that their invalid was diving. They were furious. They ordered him to stop immediately. They scheduled a medical survey board, a tribunal designed to officially declare him unfit for duty and discharge him. It was the end of the line. The doctors had the regulations on their side. The book said, amputee shall discharge. Carl knew he couldn't win an argument on paper. He had to win it in the flesh. He demanded a hearing. Not a hearing in an office, but a hearing in the field. He challenged the Navy. "Don't look at my chart," he told them. "Look at me." The Navy, perhaps hoping to humiliate him into quitting, agreed. They set up a test at the Washington Navy Yard. It was a gauntlet. They invited the admirals. They invited the captains. They brought the skeptics. The test was designed to be impossible. Carl Brashear stood on the deck of the diving barge. He was wearing the full Mark V rig. The spun copper helmet shone in the sun. The lead weights hung on his chest and back. He looked like a medieval knight. The task was simple. Climb down the ladder into the tank, perform a series of complex tasks, and then, the hardest part, climb back up. Climbing a ladder in a Mark V suit is one of the most physically demanding things a human being can do. You are lifting 300 pounds, suit plus body weight, against gravity, using only your legs and arms. You have to heave the heavy lead boots up, rung by rung. Carl stepped onto the ladder. The metal rang. He descended. He hit the water. He went to work. He stayed down for hours. He assembled pipes. He tied knots. He moved heavy weights. The admirals watched from the surface, checking their watches, waiting for him to fail. They waited for the signal that he was tired. They waited for him to panic. But the bubbles kept coming. The reports from the diver came over the comm system, calm and professional. Task complete. Moving to next objective. Finally, it was time to surface. This was the moment of truth. Going down is easy. Gravity does the work. Coming up is the fight. Carl gripped the rails of the ladder. He planted his good foot. He planted his plastic foot. And he heaved. Clang. One step. Inside the suit, the sweat was pouring into his eyes. The stump was screaming. The friction of the heavy canvas suit against his raw skin was like sandpaper. Clang. 2 steps. He broke the surface. The water drained off his helmet, doubling the weight instantly. Now he was feeling the full gravity of the earth. His prosthetic leg slipped on the wet rung. He caught himself with his arms. His triceps bulged, straining against the weight. The officers on the deck went silent. They watched the struggle. They saw the suit shaking with the effort. They knew that a normal man would have quit 3 rungs ago. Clang. 3 steps. Carl gritted his teeth. He focused on his father's face. He focused on the racism. He focused on every person who had ever called him a slur. He used their hate as fuel. He turned the pain into power. He climbed. When he reached the deck, he didn't collapse. He stepped off the ladder. He stood at attention. The tenders rushed to take off his faceplate. When they unscrewed the glass, the air rushed in. Carl Brashear took a deep breath. He looked at the lead admiral. His face was covered in sweat. His eyes were burning. "Permission to stand down, sir?" The admiral looked at the man. He looked at the plastic leg hidden under the canvas suit. He looked at the clock. Carl hadn't just passed the test. He had crushed it. He had performed better than the 2-legged divers who were used as controls. The admiral, a man of rules and regulations, slowly nodded. He realized that the rulebook was wrong. Permission granted, Chief. In 1968, Carl Brashear became the first amputee in United States naval history to be restored to full active duty as a diver. It was a victory that echoed through the entire military. It shattered the medical dogmas of the time. It proved that disability is a relative term, but Carl wasn't satisfied with just being back. He wanted the crown. He wanted to be a master diver. The master diver rating is the PhD of the ocean. It is the hardest qualification in the Navy. It requires advanced knowledge of physics, medicine, and leadership. It requires a level of physical fitness that breaks Olympic athletes. And Carl was going to do it on one leg. The road to master diver was not paved with sympathy. It was paved with skepticism. Every new command he went to, he had to prove himself all over again. He had to run with the young guys. He had to dive deeper. He had to be perfect. There were days when he couldn't walk after a shift because his stump was bleeding so badly. He would go home, soak his leg, bandage it up, and go back the next morning. He never complained. He never asked for special treatment. In 1970, 2 years after his reinstatement, Carl Brashear achieved the impossible. He earned the rating of Master Diver. He was the first African American to ever hold the title. When they pinned the badge on his chest, the trident and the seahorses, it was heavy. But it wasn't as heavy as the suit he had worn. It wasn't as heavy as the history he had carried. He had reached the summit. He was the king of the deep. But the story doesn't end with a badge. Because a master diver doesn't just dive. He leads. He teaches. And Carl Brashear was about to become the mentor for a new generation of divers who looked like him and divers who didn't. He was about to become the Master Chief. And he was about to face one final enemy. An enemy that wasn't racism and wasn't the ocean. It was time. Wearing the badge of a master diver changes the way a man walks. It isn't just a piece of cloth sewn onto a uniform. It is a symbol of absolute authority in the most dangerous environment on Earth. When a master diver walks onto a deck, the captains stop talking. The admirals listen. He is the priest of the deep, the one man who knows the secrets of the pressure and the darkness better than anyone else. For Carl Brashear, achieving the rank in 1970 was the summit of a mountain he had been climbing barefoot over broken glass for 20 years. He was the first Black American to wear the trident. He was the first amputee to wear it. He was a living impossibility. But getting to the top is different from staying there. And being a master diver isn't about how good you are in the water. It's about how good you can make them. Brashear became a teacher. He was assigned to lead diving units, to train the next generation of frogmen and salvage experts. And he was terrifying. He was known as the Man of Steel. He didn't tolerate weakness. He didn't tolerate excuses. If a student showed up late, they paid in sweat. If a student fumbled a knot, they did it again 1,000 times. He drove his men with a relentless intensity because he knew the cost of failure. He knew that underwater, incompetence is a death sentence. But there was a fundamental difference between Master Chief Brashear and the white instructors who had tried to drown him in Bayonne. The racists at the diving school had pushed him because they wanted him to break. Carl pushed his students because he wanted them to survive. He broke the cycle of abuse. He didn't sabotage their airlines. He didn't leave hate notes on their bunks. He treated every man, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, with the same rigorous fairness. He looked at a diver and saw only two things. Can you do the job, or can't you? For the young black sailors entering the Navy in the 1970s, Brashear was more than a commander. He was a myth made flesh. They had heard the whispers. There's a Master Chief with one leg. He's the toughest son of a bitch in the fleet. When they met him, when they saw him limping across the deck with that signature swagger, they stood straighter. He was proof that the ceiling had been shattered. He was the visual evidence that they belonged. But he was also a father figure to the white sailors. Many of them came from the same poor rural backgrounds as he did. They recognized the grit in him. They saw a man who had beaten the system, and they respected him for it. He taught them that prejudice was a waste of time. "The ocean doesn't care about your politics," he would say. "It only cares about your gear." He served for nearly a decade after losing his leg. He deployed to potential conflict zones. He supervised massive salvage operations. He never asked for a special accommodation. He climbed the ladders. He walked the decks in heavy seas. He hid the pain of his stump rubbing against the prosthetic, smiling through the agony because a Master Chief never shows pain. In 1979, after 31 years of service, Master Chief Petty Officer Carl Brashear finally retired. He walked down the gangway for the last time. He took off the uniform that had defined his existence. The Navy he left was unrecognizable from the Navy he had joined. When he enlisted, he was a servant. When he left, he was a king. He had forced the institution to change simply by refusing to leave it. But retirement is a dangerous time for a warrior. The silence of civilian life can be deafening. The adrenaline fades. The purpose becomes blurry. Carl didn't stop. He went to work as a civilian employee for the government, continuing to serve in naval engineering and safety. He couldn't stay away from the water. It was in his blood. However, the world outside the Navy was beginning to catch up to his story. For years, his life had been a Navy legend, a sea story told in bars from Norfolk to San Diego. But in the late 1990s, Hollywood came knocking. The script for Men of Honor began to circulate. It attracted heavy hitters. Cuba Gooding Jr. signed on to play Carl. Robert De Niro signed on to play the amalgam of the racist instructors who had tormented him. Suddenly, the sharecropper's son was walking red carpets. The production of the movie was a surreal experience for Carl. He was a technical advisor on the set. He watched actors reenact the worst moments of his life. He watched them recreate the bag of tools scene, the courtroom scene, the moment his leg was shattered. It was a strange kind of therapy. To see his trauma projected onto a massive screen, to see millions of people weeping for his pain and cheering for his victory, was a profound validation. The silence was broken. The world knew. When the movie premiered in 2000, Carl Brashear became a global icon. He wasn't just a Navy hero anymore. He was a symbol of the human spirit. He received letters from all over the world, from amputees in war zones, from kids in inner cities, from people fighting cancer. They all said the same thing. If you could do it, maybe I can too. He traveled the country giving speeches. He would walk onto the stage, his limp visible, his white hair cropped close. He didn't use a teleprompter. He spoke from the heart. He gave the world a new philosophy. It was simple, brutal, and beautiful. "It's not a sin to get knocked down," he would say, his voice gravelly with age. "It's a sin to stay down." This wasn't a cliche to him. It was a tactical doctrine. He had been knocked down by poverty, knocked down by racism, knocked down by a steel pipe, knocked down by the bureaucracy, and every single time he had stood back up. He taught people that disability is a mindset. He would tap his prosthetic leg with his cane and smile. "I ain't disabled," he would joke. "I'm just lighter." But he also used his fame to do the hard work. He visited the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. By the early 2000s, a new war was raging, the global war on terror. Young men and women were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, missing legs, arms, and eyes. They were lying in hospital beds, staring at the ceiling, just like he had in 1966. They were wondering if their lives were over. And then the door would open, and in would walk Master Chief Carl Brashear. He would pull up a chair. He would roll up his pant leg and show them the plastic and the metal. he would tell them the truth. "It's going to hurt," he would say. "It's going to be hell. But you are not done. You are still a warrior." He gave them permission to hope. He showed them that there was life after the loss. He was the living proof that you could be whole even if you weren't intact. One young Marine who had lost a leg to an IED reportedly asked him, "Chief, how did you handle the people staring?" Carl leaned in. "I made sure that when they stared, they saw a man standing tall. I gave them something worth looking at." This was his final mission. He was the patron saint of the broken. He was the grandfather of the wounded warrior movement. But the years were taking their toll. His heart, which had pumped so much courage through his veins, was growing tired. He developed respiratory and heart issues. The body that had been forged in steel was finally yielding to time. Yet even in his final years, he refused to be pitied. He lived independently. He drove his car. He polished his metals. He kept his shoes shined. He died on July 25th, 2006. He was 75 years old. His funeral was fit for a head of state. The Navy wept. Admirals saluted. The divers of the fleet, the men of the deep, stood in formation. They played taps. But the most powerful tribute didn't come from the brass. It came from the divers. There is a tradition in the Navy diving community. When a diver retires or passes away, his boots are bronzed. But for Carl, the tribute was in the water. Divers around the world, on ships and in harbors, took a moment of silence. They looked at their own gear. They looked at the heavy helmets and the umbilical cords, and they knew that the job was a little easier, the burden a little lighter, because Carl Brashear had carried the heaviest load for them. He left behind a Navy that was fundamentally different from the one he joined. He left behind a path that was open to everyone. But his legacy is not just for divers. It is for anyone who has ever been told no. Anyone who has been told they are too dark, too poor, too uneducated, or too broken. Carl Brashear proved that the human will is the strongest material in the universe. Stronger than copper. Stronger than steel. Stronger than hate. As we move to the final blocks of this story, we will look at the specific lessons of his life. We will break down his code of survival. We will look at the monuments that bear his name. And we will issue the final challenge to the viewer. To find their own ocean. To find their own impossible ladder. And to climb it. The Master Chief has left the deck. But the dive continues. When Carl Brashear climbed that ladder in 1968, he didn't just save his own career. He saved the careers of thousands of men and women who hadn't even been born yet. In the military, regulations are written in stone. The physical standards for enlistment and retention are not guidelines, they are commandments. For centuries, the logic was binary and brutal. If you lose a limb, you are broken. If you are broken, you are a liability. You are discharged. There was no middle ground. There was no room for negotiation. The military viewed the human body as a collection of parts, and if a part was missing, the machine was defective. Carl Brashear took a sledgehammer to that logic. By forcing the Navy to evaluate him on his performance rather than his anatomy, he established a legal and medical precedent that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. He proved that a prosthetic limb is not a disqualification. It is merely an equipment modification. He proved that the human will can compensate for the loss of bone and muscle. We call this the Brashear effect. Fast forward to the 21st century. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan produced a new generation of wounded warriors. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, tore legs and arms off soldiers, Marines, and sailors at a horrific rate. In previous wars, these men would have been sent home immediately, their careers over, their identities shattered. But because of the path Carl Brashear cut through the jungle of bureaucracy, a new conversation was possible. Today, you will find amputees serving in the Green Berets. You will find them in the Navy SEALs. You will find them flying combat aircraft. They are running into battle on carbon fiber blades. They are jumping out of airplanes. They are deploying to combat zones. They are doing this because Carl Brashear stood in a courtroom in 1968 and said, "Watch me." He forced the military to look at the man, not the manual. He forced the medical boards to ask, "Can he do the job?" instead of, "Does he have 2 legs?" It was a shift from a philosophy of exclusion to a philosophy of capability. Every time a wounded soldier fights to stay in uniform today, they are cashing a check that Master Chief Brashear wrote with his own blood. But the Navy had one final honor left to give him. An honor that is usually reserved for presidents, admirals, and politicians. Naming a ship. In the United States Navy, the name on the hull of a ship is a sacred thing. It defines the soul of the vessel. For decades, ships were named after battles, states, or white war heroes. The idea of a U.S. naval ship bearing the name of a black enlisted man, a man who started his career cleaning toilets, was unthinkable. Until it wasn't. In 2008, 2 years after his death, the Navy christened the USNS Carl Brashear, TH-7. It is a Lewis and Clark-class dry cargo ship. It is 689 feet long. It displaces 41,000 tons. It is a massive, gray leviathan of steel, and painted on its bow in letters 10 feet tall is the name of the sharecropper's son from Tonyville, Kentucky. The symbolism of the ship is perfect. The USNS Carl Brashear is not a destroyer. It is not a battleship designed to kill. It is a supply ship. Its mission is to deliver ammunition, food, fuel, and repair parts to the fleet. It is the lifeline. It supports the other ships. It keeps the Navy moving. This was Carl's life. He was a servant who became a savior. He spent his career fixing what was broken, finding what was lost, and supporting the mission. Now, a ship made of steel does the same thing in his name. The christening ceremony in San Diego was a moment of profound historical correction. Imagine the scene. The bottle of champagne smashing against the bow. The streamers flying. The crowd cheering. And standing on the platform, Carl's sons, Dwayne and Philip. They looked up at that massive wall of steel and saw their father's name. They thought about the shack in Kentucky with the dirt floor. They thought about the N-word notes on the bunk in Bayonne. They thought about the leg buried in a medical waste incinerator. And they realized that their father had won. He had won the long game. The racists who tried to drown him were forgotten dust. The officers who tried to discharge him were footnotes in a personnel file. But Carl Brashear was a ship. He was iron. He was 40,000 tons of American power floating in the Pacific Ocean. The USNS Carl Brashear travels the world. It pulls into ports in Japan, Korea, the Middle East. When it arrives, sailors from other navies ask, "Who was Carl Brashear?" And the story is told again. The legend spreads. It is a reminder that in America, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, if you are strong enough to bend it yourself. But the Brashear effect goes beyond the military. It speaks to the universal human experience of being underestimated. Carl Brashear is the patron saint of the underdog. He represents the idea that your starting point does not determine your finishing point. He started as a steward with a 7th grade education. He finished as a master diver with a ship named after him. This trajectory destroys the excuses we make for ourselves. We say, "I can't do it because I don't have the money." Carl didn't have money. We say, "I can't do it because the system is rigged." The system was rigged against Carl. We say, "I can't do it because I'm hurt." Carl was missing a leg. He stripped away every justification for mediocrity. He proved that excellence is the best revenge. He didn't argue with the people who hated him. He outworked them. He outlasted them. He outperformed them. There is a story from the ship's maiden voyage. The captain of the USNS, Carl Brashear, gathered the crew. He told them about the man the ship was named for. He told them about the bag of tools. He told them about the ladder. And he gave them a motto for the ship, based on Carl's life. Failure is not an option. That motto is painted on the bulkheads. It is etched into the coins given to the crew. It is the spirit of the vessel. When the ship is at sea, facing a storm, pitching and rolling in the waves, the crew knows that they are riding in a vessel named after a man who faced worse storms than this. They know that the steel holding them up is infused with the spirit of the Master Chief. And what of the medical legacy? Today, at the Naval Diving and Salvage Training Center in Panama City, Florida, the modern version of the school that tried to break him, there is a building named the Carl Brashear Training Center. Every young diver who wants to wear the Mark V helmet has to walk through doors bearing his name. The instructors tell his story on day one. They tell the white students, the black students, the Hispanic students. They tell them, this is the standard. If you think you are having a hard day, think about Brashear. He has become the yardstick by which all Navy divers measure their toughness. He is the ghost in the machine, the presence in the water. But perhaps the most poignant part of his legacy is the letter he wrote to his son, Philip, shortly before he died. In it, he summed up his philosophy. It's not a sin to get knocked down. It's a sin to stay down. I have been knocked down often, but I have never stayed there. I have always gotten up. This is the message that resonates with the civilian world. You don't have to be a diver to understand it. You don't have to be an amputee. We all have our sharks. We all have our broken pipes. We all have the voices in our heads, or in our lives, telling us that we aren't good enough. Carl Brashear tells us to ignore the noise. He tells us to check our air, trust our training, and keep walking. As we approach the final chapter of this saga, we must ask ourselves what we are going to do with this example. Are we going to just admire it? Or are we going to use it? The ship is sailing. The divers are diving. The legacy is secure. But the final lesson of Carl Brashear is not about what he did. It's about what he refused to do. He refused to be a victim. In the next and final block, we will bring the Master Chief home. We will synthesize the lessons of the sharecropper, the steward, the diver, and the legend. We will look at the grave in the Woodlawn Memorial Gardens, and we will issue the final call to action to the audience, to find their own ladder and to climb it no matter how much it hurts. The air is clear. The visibility is unlimited. The Master Chief is watching. We are about to surface. We began this story in the dust of a Kentucky field in the 1930s. We saw a young boy holding a plow, looking at the bent back of his father, hearing the command to run for his life. We followed him to the galley of an aircraft carrier, where he scrubbed pots and dreamed of the deep. We watched him bleed in the water of Bayonne, fight the currents of the Mediterranean, and lose a part of himself on the deck of the USS Hoist. Now, we stand at the end of the line. We stand at Woodlawn Memorial Gardens in Norfolk, Virginia. The grass is green. The air is quiet. There is a simple headstone. It does not scream. It does not boast. It lists his name, Carl M. Brashear. It lists his rank, Master Chief Boatswain's Mate. It lists his wars, Korea, Vietnam. But if you stand there long enough, and if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the sound of heavy boots clanging against a metal ladder. Clang, clang, clang. It is the sound of a man who refused to stay down. Carl Brashear's life is the ultimate American paradox. He served a country that tried to break him. He loved a navy that tried to drown him. He gave his body to a system that viewed him as disposable. Why? It wasn't because he was naive. He knew exactly what they thought of him. He saw the hate in their eyes every day. He did it because he understood something that his tormentors did not. He understood that honor is not a medal you wear on your chest. It is not a rank you wear on your sleeve. Honor is a private covenant. It is a promise you make to yourself in the dark. The racist instructors in New Jersey thought honor was about whiteness. They thought it was about exclusion. Carl showed them that honor is about endurance. It is about holding your breath when the air is cut off. It is about walking when your leg is gone. He took the concept of the self-made man and turned it into literal reality. He remade himself. When the world said he was a cook, he made himself a diver. When the world said he was uneducated, he made himself a master. When the world said he was an amputee, he made himself a legend. He sculpted his own destiny out of the raw material of his pain. This is the lesson of the sharecropper who became a king. It teaches us that our starting point is irrelevant. The soil you are born on does not dictate how high you can climb. The poverty of your pocketbook does not determine the richness of your character. Carl Brashear didn't have money. He didn't have connections. He didn't have a degree. He had grit. And grit is the one currency that never devalues. But his story forces us to look in the mirror. It forces us to confront our own excuses. We all have our sharks. Maybe your shark isn't a racist instructor. Maybe it is debt. Maybe it is addiction. Maybe it is a broken marriage, or a diagnosis, or a depression that feels like 300 feet of water pressing down on your chest. We all have our broken pipes. The accidents. The tragedies that snap the cable of our lives and leave us bleeding on the deck. And we all have that moment in the hospital bed. The moment where the doctor, or the lawyer, or the boss, or the voice in your head says, "Give up. Take the pension. Stay down. It's safer down there." Carl Brashear is standing in that room with you. He is leaning on his cane. He is looking at you with those intense, kind eyes. And he is asking you the only question that matters. Are you going to let them win? If you stay down, the doubt wins. The fear wins. The people who said you couldn't do it win. But if you get up, if you strap on the prosthetic, if you grab the rails of the ladder, you change the game. The climb is not easy. That is the hard truth of the Brashear legacy. He never said it would be easy. He said it would be worth it. When he climbed that ladder in the courtroom in 1968, every step was agony. He was lifting 300 pounds of canvas and lead with a stump that was raw meat. He was sweating. He was shaking. He was suffering. But he didn't stop. That is the challenge I leave with you today. Find your ladder. It might be a degree you think you're too old to get. It might be a business you're too scared to start. It might be a trauma you're too terrified to face. Find it. Look at it. Respect the weight of it. And then climb. Climb until your muscles burn. Climb until your lungs scream. Climb until the people watching you, the skeptics, the haters, the doubters, go silent in awe. You do not need two legs to stand tall. You do not need a perfect past to have a glorious future. You just need the will to take one more step. As we leave the cemetery in Virginia, the sun is setting. The shadows are long, but the spirit of the Master Chief is not in the ground. It is in the water. It is in the 7th Fleet, sailing through the Pacific. It is in the training tanks in Panama City. It is in the heart of every person who refuses to accept the word impossible. The USNS Carl Brashear is out there right now, cutting through the waves. It is carrying fuel. It is carrying food. It is carrying the name of a hero to the ends of the earth. It is a 40,000-ton monument to the idea that you can't sink a good man. We have dusted off the files. We have told the truth about the notes on the bunk and the blood in the boot. We have given the Master Chief the salute he earned 1,000 times over. Now, the watch is yours. The algorithm of the internet wants you to forget this. It wants you to scroll to the next distraction. It wants you to be passive. Do not be passive. Be a diver. Go deep. Share this video. Send it to someone who is hurting. Send it to someone who has been knocked down. Send it to someone who needs to know that the bottom is not the end. It is just the place where you push off to start rising. And finally, I have one last request. A final act of solidarity with the man of steel. Go to the comments section right now. I want you to type the phrase that defined his life. The phrase that is painted on the bulkheads of his ship. The phrase that should be tattooed on your soul. Type, "Failure is not an option." Let's fill the comments with a wall of resolve. Let's show the world that the spirit of Carl Brashear is alive and well. Let's make the algorithm bow down to the Master Chief. Master Chief Petty Officer, Carl Brashear. You have climbed the final ladder. You have breached the surface. You have found the air. You are relieved. We have the dive from here. To everyone watching, take a deep breath. Fill your lungs. Feel the air. That is the taste of freedom. That is the taste of life. Now, go find your water, and don't be afraid to get wet. Thank you for watching. Keep climbing. Keep fighting. And never ever stay down.